Welcome back to DC Wrap. I'm Pat Pobletti with WisPolitics.com. And joining me this week is pollster Ken Goldstein, a professor of political science at the University of San Francisco, former professor here at UW-Madison, who has written extensively on political advertising, voter turnout, survey methodology, and other things relating to the presidential election, and whose political analysis features pretty regularly on a number of mainstream media outlets. Ken, that was a mouthful of an intro. Did I get all of your titles right?
Thank you, and good to be back with WisPolitics. I just wish Jeff Mayers was buying me a meal at the Madison Club when I was doing this. So
I'll have him buy me one instead. How about that?
Okay, we can put that on Jeff's tab.
Absolutely.
Happy to be here. Happy to join you.
So let's start off with the recently released Marquette University Law School poll. Top line, 46% of likely voters back Joe Biden, while 41% favor President Trump. Now, that gap between Biden and Trump has been steadily somewhere between 4 to 6 points since late spring in the Marquette poll. And there have been a number of things that have happened since then that I think would have been major game changers in almost any other election that simply haven't really changed the race here in Wisconsin. So I want to put it to you. We're less than a month out. Biden's lead's been pretty stubborn. I don't think anyone would say it's a done deal here in Wisconsin, but the president does face a pretty steep uphill climb here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, the first rule of politics, the first rule of polling, and the first rule of Wisconsin is Charles Franklin knows what he's doing. But it is quite stunning, the stability that we are seeing in the Marquette poll. But not surprising, because actually when you look at the average of the nationwide polls, if you look at, there's been some blips here and there, but if you look at any of the people who do the averages, it's been +1 or +2 from an 8-point race since March. And if you and I sat here, I don't think we could even begin to name all the things that have happened since March, not to mention all the things that have happened in the last week, right? So I think this is a race that, if not fully baked, if not already been baked for months, is getting pretty baked. And you have a very low number of undecideds, and you have two candidates who people know well, and we're getting a very stable race, even as you say, there's so much going on nationally and so much going on in Wisconsin.
So you touched on that number of undecided, and that's another little nugget I want to pluck out from the most recent Marquette poll, in that Charles found that 8% of likely voters are undecided at this point. And I'm curious to hear from you, how much danger do you think that presents to the Biden campaign? And are there any data points we can look at in terms of previous elections as to how late deciders have broken in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have in front of me how many undecided Charles showed at a similar time last cycle. But listen, the assumption about undecideds is that they do one of a couple things, and the first assumption is they don't vote, right? That if you're actually undecided now, what else are you going to learn that's going to make you want to vote? So some chunk of that undecided are not going to vote. And then our usual assumption is of that 8%, some will end up voting for third-party candidates, and then the remainder will split. But what happened in 2016 is it was a lot bigger chunk of undecideds. Many of them did vote, and instead of splitting equally between Clinton and Trump, they went overwhelmingly for Trump. But the reason why that was the case is something that's very different than this year. And I think everyone's so scarred from 2016 that we're all a little bit afraid to say what's different about this year as well. And what's different is Hillary Clinton was underwater in terms of her favorability nationally, underwater in the state of Wisconsin. So those undecideds are, right, you have lovers and haters in life and in politics. They were people who didn't like Trump and didn't like Clinton. You have a many fewer people this time around who dislike both Trump and Biden, and Biden's actually net favorable.
Now, one more thing I want to touch on with you is something that I've heard from Republicans both on this show and in just my day-to-day as a reporter, and that's this notion that the polls aren't fully capturing President Trump's support, and that you should essentially give the president a couple point bump in most polls that you see. What do you make of that argument?
So listen, there were many mistakes with polls in 2016. Not the Marquette poll, right? Which didn't properly weight by education and had too few non-college educated whites. So many, but not all polls have corrected for that. So that's going to help a little bit. And then there's this notion that, listen, I think it's less likely that there's people who are, I'm not sure, people talk about shy Trump voters, and you often don't hear the word shy and Trump in the same sentence. So I'm not sure that there are people who are really going to vote for Trump but are telling us they're going to vote for Biden. I think it's more likely, trying to even give you a little Wisconsin sports example, right? The Packers are winning, so everyone reads the sports pages the next day. I sound a little antiquated when I say the sports pages, right? For anyone who actually reads newspapers. But when the Packers win, you're consuming more football news. When they lose, how do you deal with them losing? Well, you just don't read as many articles when they lose. So I think when the environment is good for one party or bad for another party, you have fewer people taking surveys. So I think it's perfectly plausible that Republicans might not have been particularly excited the last week to do a survey, and that's possibly the reason why we're seeing some of these huge national numbers, right? Like plus 13 or 14 in NBC Wall Street Journal, plus 16 or 17 in CNN. Those are probably at the high end of reality and have something to do with the fact that, I'm giving you a really long answer here, not so much that Trump voters are lying, but that Republicans who may not even be fans of Donald Trump, but will end up voting for the Republican, just aren't so excited to talk to pollsters now.
And I want to wrap up by circling back to something you talked about kind of at the top here, and that was in terms of the consistency that we've seen from Biden over the last 5 months or so in regards to polls. When you look at polls from other battleground states as well as nationally, you talk a little bit about how there's been some consistency there. I was just hoping you could expand on that a little bit more.
So it wasn't so much the polls from other battleground states, but it was the national polling has been very consistent as there's been a few events since March. It is interesting to look at how some of the high quality state polls may or may not be matching up. So Wisconsin's obviously different from Pennsylvania, but you would also expect them to move a bit in tandem. And so when you have results in some battleground states, especially battleground states that are somewhat similar, right? Like a Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, when those don't correlate well, that does set up my spidey senses a little bit about something that's being missed, and that both of those things can't be correct.
So lastly, Ken, I always give my guests
you don't
here
often hear spidey senses in polling.
It was a unique one, but we certainly appreciate it. And the last thing I have for you is I always try and close out by giving my guests a little bit of time to kind of talk to political insiders about what's on your brain. What should they be thinking about? So the floor is all yours.
Wow. What should they be thinking about? So listen, I focus, and as folks who know me from Wisconsin, I do try and focus on the nerdy sorts of things. But I do think. Listen, this is the DC wrap, and I don't know if you're sitting in DC when you do the DC wrap. I am. And I find it amusing how suddenly everyone here in DC inside the Beltway has suddenly become an expert on non-college educated whites in square states, right? So no one here in Washington, DC or suburban Maryland or suburban Virginia is, quite sure what the difference is between Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But everyone's sort of on to this difference between non-college educated whites. And, I do really think it's interesting to look at a state like Wisconsin, which, you have certain states in the union that are going more Democratic because they are becoming more diverse. That is not what's going on in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a very white state, 90%. And the variance in Wisconsin is how the college-educated whites vote in different areas and the movement of non-college educated whites to the Republicans. So I'm probably telling folks in Wisconsin something that they're already paying attention to, but for those of us who are now outside Wisconsin, it is one of the few states where you have this huge disconnect between how college-educated whites vote. And just, the simple reason, the simple example is, imagine a college-educated voter, white college-educated voter in Waukesha versus a white college-educated voter 40 miles west in Dane County. Those are, one's going over 2-to-1 Democratic, maybe more. The other one's going probably 2-to-1 Republican.
Well, I'm not in the Beltway. I'm right off the Belt line, rather, not in the Beltway. So a little bit of difference there. But hey, Ken, I really appreciate you taking the time, lending your insight to our viewers and our readers. And like I said, thank you for coming on.
Excellent. Until Mayor's, I want that drink at the Madison Club.
I'll let him know. Until next week, I'm Pat Pobletti, and thanks for tuning in.